Hello, my name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest. My guest today is an old friend, Richard Lowry, an American author, the editor of National Review. In fact, Rich and I are the only two living persons who've been editor-in-chief of National Review. And we worked together, I think we worked together for about 8 years when I was the editor and you came on board first of all as, I think, a general reporter, and it gradually rose to be the Washington correspondent and then editor. So it's a great pleasure to be talking to you again, Rich, though we do talk fairly often. You have gone on to do other things as well as editor, and you're a frequent guest on NBC News, Meet the Press, and now you've written, I think it must be your third book at least, which is The Case for Nationalism, how it made us, rich, powerful and free. Now, American nationalism, in my view, is an extremely rich topic, much more rich than the nationalism of most other countries, partly because America is such a powerful country, but not just for that reason. So I'm going to throw some ideas at you and get your response, and we'll go deeper into them. What, to begin with, is American exceptionalism? I think it's fair to say you're a devotee of the concept of American exceptionalism, but what is it?
Well, first of all, John, pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm in your debt in so many ways, including for the seed of this book. That this was a topic you were writing about and thinking about in the pages of National Review and elsewhere way before anyone else. So you're prescient on this topic, and I'm in your debt, as so many other people are. So American exceptionalism, I think they're just unique cultural aspects of America that ultimately the source of them was Britain. But we are a people who rules bound, respect the rule of law, a huge regard for individual liberty, a kind of a stubbornness, an optimism, a gun culture that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, a resistance, although this is eroded, to big centralizing government. Still, we're distinct in that respect compared to the other advanced Western countries. So these are all things that set us apart. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. We're also, in many ways, a uniquely violent culture. And you see that especially in the American South. But these are things that they're part of our DNA. They have been from the very beginning. And by the very beginning, I mean prior to 1776 and our Declaration of Independence, really almost from the first time that British Americans set foot on our shores.
Well, that's true, I think. Would you agree with Paul Johnson in his history of the American people? I think he says that what was different between Britain and America was that the ideas of liberty in Britain were given much greater reality in America because it was possible for a man, by his own efforts, to earn enough in his lifetime to own his own farm and build a family and, in a sense, live a completely independent life.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's even deeper than that. The key foundation of America, I believe, was New England, and the stream of people who settled on Massachusetts Bay came overwhelmingly from East Anglia in England, which had very distinctive cultural aspects of its own. Highly Puritan area, highly commercial area, an area where you've had various rebellions against the monarchy and central authority. And you really had the people who were most reflected that culture who came over. And it was a very unusual migration because it wasn't just individual rootless men, in their 20s. It was entire families and communities and churches. And one thing I hadn't realized before doing the research for this book, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there was an exception, a loophole where they're able to take the charter they got from the king to settle Massachusetts Bay and bring it over with them. And there's a controversy where the king and people around him wanted to go and get the charter because they weren't happy, particularly with the religious practices in Massachusetts Bay, which were heterodox, the way they were governing themselves. And as soon as word got to Massachusetts Bay that the king might come and take the charter, the decision was made that he would be resisted by force. So this is, 150 years before the American Revolution. You have these stubborn people in Massachusetts and Boston contemplating a revolt against British royal authority. And 150 years later, there would actually be a revolt, and a successful one, centered in Boston and Massachusetts Bay. And despite kind of the long list of abuses that are hurled at the King of England in the Declaration of Independence, prior to 1776, we are the freest country on earth, the freest people on earth. We are very lightly governed from Britain. And this just allowed this distinct American culture and national identity prior to there being an independent nation to develop.
You had, I think, about 4 main regional identities, didn't you? You certainly had the Cavaliers founding a very different kind of settlement in the southern states. And I think Paul Johnson said that one of the founding characters of the American personality was Sir Walter Raleigh, whom he described as a kind of adventurous huckster, a man who came here to make money.
Yeah, that's a key aspect to our national character. We see it, some people would argue, reflected in the President of the United States to this this very day as we speak. But adventurous, with an eye to the bottom line, willing to improvise, key aspects of the American character. And then there are aspects of our character that come directly from the Bible. And this is not distinct necessarily just to America. One theme I write about in my book is that wherever anyone was reading the story of the Old Testament, particularly in the vernacular, people imagine themselves as being the new Israel, as being the new chosen people. So that was certainly true here in America, where the idea that we're living in a promised land, the idea we're a chosen people or an almost chosen people, as Abraham Lincoln put it more modestly and appropriately, and the idea of a covenant were just hugely important. The first covenant in our history is the Mayflower Compact, even before those folks set foot on our shores. And then all throughout New England, wherever a new town or church was established, it was established via a covenant, this kind of deal among people. And the most important covenant in our history is the Constitution, which creates a powerful national government, but a limited national government that is constrained in very important ways.
Now, there's another concept of America, and one which has gained a lot of progress and advanced a lot in the last sort of 40 years, and that's the idea of America as an idea, America as a proposition nation. Would you like to just briefly explain to people what that means?
Yeah, so this is a point of view that focuses a lot of attention on the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, those kind of honeyed words that set out the purposes of government, and has a conception of America as defined only by those words and ideas, and progressing only insofar as it's advancing towards achieving those ideas. Now, there's a lot to this, but my argument is that no country is just an idea. No country is an abstraction. And if we weren't as spread out across the country, if we didn't have the territorial extent we did, if we didn't have the power we did, if we didn't have a national government that was credible and coherent, these ideas would have been discredited and collapsed. So the nation as such and the ideas live in a symbiotic relationship and depend on one another and influence one another. So just saying that America is an idea is a mistake.
Now, you've just given us, I think, your own view, which is a limited view of the American idea. You see a place in the broad American cultural nationalism picture for it, but it's not the only thing. I mean, I think we've discussed it. We think of it as a kind of a distilled essence of what American nationalism is. But what is interesting to me is that this is an idea this proposition nation theory has made tremendous advances in the post-war world. And that's including among conservatives. I was wondering why you think that has been.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. In fact, just circle back to another, I think, important aspect of this discussion is our culture is hugely important, and it's influenced by the ideas, and the culture helped create the ideas, or at least the fertile ground for the ideas. But if the Americans spoke another language other than English, or had multiple languages, this would be an entirely different country, whatever was said in the Declaration of Independence. And I think conservatives, at least recently, have kind of lost touch with these deeper truths about the country. And I think it's been under the influence of a globalizing business elite. The great late social scientist Samuel Huntington wrote about how in the 19th century, business innovations and technical innovations, they created a national affiliation and loyalty and market over and above local loyalties and markets. And that was the 19th century. Late 20th, 21st century, you have business developments and innovations and technologies creating this transnational sense and transnational market and a sense of transnational loyalty, although I don't think there's really any such thing when push comes to shove, over and above national loyalty and a national market. And a lot of these businessmen, they're free market types. They're very influential in the Republican Party, and I think their attitudes have been absorbed, consciously or not, by a lot of conservatives. Certainly in the Bush era, there was an emphasis on what clearly, at least in retrospect, seems an overly idealistic foreign policy, where I'm simplifying, but an underlying premise of it was just everyone around the world is the same. If you just topple a dictator, then everyone who's been repressed by this dictator is a liberal Democrat. And that's just not true. To create liberal Democrats takes a lot of time. It took centuries of cultural and political development in the West. And it's not just something you can create instantly. And then also on immigration policy, there's been a fight. You have been a big part of this within the right about whether we should be restrictionist or whether we should be more open borders. Ronald Reagan, obviously a great conservative hero. You've written a book about him and Thatcher and the Pope, was basically more, I wouldn't say open borders, but much more, had a more latitudinarian attitude on immigration than others on the right. So there's a segment of the right that just thinking about a border is kind of small-minded. So you put all that together and you get kind of a cosmopolitan flavor to a certain variant of conservatism. And I think this had become quite influential, and it was a real shock to the system when Donald Trump showed up and just said very basic things that just most people would instinctively agree with, but that were shocking to an element of the conservative elite because they've been under the influence of these developments I was just discussing.
I was interested. You mentioned Sam Huntington's book, which I think both of us felt was a fine book. And yet, looking back, do you think that book has had a lot of influence? Or has it had its subterranean influence? Because at the time, I thought its launch was very effectively sabotaged, so that people were almost afraid to hold a copy on the grounds that it might make them look, in a sense, critical of the subversive America in some sense, but also fundamentally mean-minded.
Yeah, well, I think it's been influential among a segment of the right, but didn't have a broader impact. And in fact, pretty much all the trends that he wrote about, and it's been a while, isn't it? It was 15 years ago or whatever, when this book was published, all the trends have gotten worse.
Yeah. Well, there's one point I want to pick up and go further with. I think you quote him, I think you're in agreement with him, when he says the US is unique in having an elite which is actually hostile to its own country, both denationalized and maybe denationalizing. You know, I can give you a quote here, which I think you will find interesting, from Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister of Britain, basically the 1880s, 1890s. And he writes at one point, "I believe England is the only country in the world which, whenever it is engaged in a conflict, finds a large body of its eminent citizens sympathising more with the other side." Now, I want to explore for a minute or two the links between your nationalism, the American nationalism, and those of the other countries of the English-speaking world, because I do see what I would call as the kind of a collective genus of Anglosphere nationalism with obvious important national differences. What's your own feeling there?
I think there's a lot to that. I think when we talked about American exceptionalism at the top, I'm a big believer in British exceptionalism as well, and the English-speaking world being exceptional. So we're all part of a West and a Western civilization, but it's definitely a distinctive strand. And if you want to find a commonality among a certain class of countries, just go to whether they speak English or not, and that will go a long way to telling you a lot about how those countries are governed, what their basic attitudes are, what their attitudes are to the worth of the individual. So this is a hugely important cultural legacy that comes from England.
Presumably, I think would we feel that all of these countries have a more liberal political culture in the old-fashioned sense of the word liberal? One further question on types of nationalism. How does German nationalism, how does French nationalism compare to the Anglosphere and American nationalisms?
I think in the case of Germany, and I'm no expert, and obviously this is shelves of books have been written about it, but their nationalism is late developing. England is an extremely old, coherent nation compared to Germany. There's a German cultural nation, but it wasn't one distinct polity. It was highly influential in the Holy Roman Empire, but it was not a coherent nation the way England was from the beginning. So there was, as the scholar Leah Greenfield argues, I think persuasively, there's a sense of inferiority there, and I think that tends to twist nationalisms. So we've seen it in Russia, we've seen it in Serbia, we saw it in a terrible period in the 19th, 20th century in Germany. It tends to express itself in an overly aggressive attitude and a certain amount of paranoia, and also the tradition just wasn't liberal. Bismarck was not Hitler. He wasn't anything close, but he was not an English-speaking liberal of the sort we've just been discussing. And then you get fascism in Nazi Germany coming from all sorts of unique conditions, many of which stemming from World War I. French nationalism talked about how whenever people read the Bible, they thought they were the chosen people, and this was true of the French. They thought they had the most Christian king, and Catholicism was a key part of their identity. That has been contested over time, and you've had different versions of French nationalism. But basically, I delve a little bit into the story of Joan of Arc, which I think obviously extremely moving. But she was leading a fight to liberate her nation, and this is just a extremely basic impulse. And even though she was captured by the English and tortured and burned, and her ashes spread in the Seine River to try to destroy all memory of her and what she had done, she became a symbol of the nation and was indestructible in that sense. And the example of Joan and her fight for French independence has been a thread going throughout French history. Again, contested. You know, you had various sides laying claim to her. But I just think it's very moving that, you know, de Gaulle and his Free French forces in World War II, they used the Cross of Lorraine, Joan's symbol, as the symbol on their planes and their tanks. And one thing I've kind of changed my view on is a lot of conservatives have had this very slighting view of France. You know, we call them surrender monkeys, you know, during the Iraq War when they were very resistant to it. They've been extremely difficult to deal with in terms of NATO over time. But I've come more to respect that kind of impulse to being a stubborn and independent people. And I think that's much better than what we see among some of the governing elites of Europe now, which is wanting to, at least in theory, subsume their nationality into the supranational institution of the EU, when actually it's really about governing other people, you know, which is not a nationalist impulse at all, especially from the Germans.
As a matter of fact, I completely agree with what you've just said about France and French nationalism, and indeed about the part Joan of Arc plays in French mythology in the good sense. It's interesting, you mentioned the Free French in the war, but it's interesting also that as late as the 1950s, a modern French playwright, a very gifted one, Jean Anouilh, he wrote a wonderful play about Joan of Arc, a modernist play actually, in which the characters step in and out of character, the actors step in and out of character, but it's profoundly moving with an absolutely brilliant ending, which I won't spoil for you now, but it's well worth trying to get it. Thank you, and I also very much agree with the point you made about the way in which nationalism gets mixed in with that. If you think of nationalism as love of country, well, love, romantic and sexual love, they often get mixed up with other qualities which are not intrinsic to them, like jealousy, which leads to murder. But it would be a very bad thing, wouldn't it, to be opposed to romantic love on the ground that it might lead to divorce or murder. It might also lead to a happy marriage, family, and someone holding your hand when you're on your deathbed. So, I think we've got to broaden this, and you have done so, I think. Now, I'd like to move to a slightly different point. Your book is one of several that have come out in the last 3 or 4 years, and they're all of them in different angles on the question, but they all are about the revival of the concept of nationalism, patriotism, and so on. I think one of the most interesting, apart from your own, is the book by Yoram Hazany, which is an attempt to actually construct an entire political outlook on the national principle. Now, first of all, do you have any particular points of agreement or disagreement with Yoram? Because he has now become, so to speak, the guru of a certain kind of international nationalist movement.
Yeah, well, it's a brilliant book and had a lot of influence on my thinking. Where I depart with Yoram is his hostility to liberalism, which he basically thinks is dissolving Western societies before our eyes. And there is a variant of what you could call liberalism, progressive liberalism, that has had a deleterious effect on our national and social cohesion. But in America, I think certain kind of liberalism, as we discussed, was part of our character from the very beginning. And the country basically, thrived for close to 200 years, having intact families and a respect for norms and virtues, traditional virtues. And then something happened beginning in the 1970s. And I think what happened in the 1970s was not a close study of John Locke. And so Locke began destroying us in the 70s. There are obviously other social forces. So that's the deeper point where I depart from Yoram. And then we have all sorts of kind of policy disagreements. But that was my main problem with this book.
Well, that's really interesting because obviously the policy disagreements are splitting the conservative movement on this issue, aren't they? I particularly, for example, would like to get your view on the degree to which a belief in nationalism and the importance of the nation requires us to adopt a collectivist economic policy. That seems to be the opinion of some people. I wonder what your view was.
Well, I think it clearly means we have to have a strong and capable national government. This is just obvious, goes back to the key nationalists at the beginning of the formal start of the American nation, Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. And they just realized if we tried to live under the Articles of Confederation, where you didn't have a national government worthy of the name, we would just fall apart. And the European countries would pick us apart from the periphery. We'd be torn apart by internal divisions, and it just wasn't going to work. And they were absolutely right. And Hamilton's view that we should attempt to become a great power on par with Britain was the correct one. We largely followed his formula, with some wandering here or there, and it largely succeeded. So there's some conservatives that think we should just have no federal government, basically, and that's unrealistic. It's not part of the mainstream of the American tradition. So I do think there's obviously a role for government, but then you have a argument. So once we agree that we have strong and capable government, what does that mean? How extensive is it? And I think the basic test should be: is any given policy in our national interest? That should be the first question. And I think some conservatives, and I would include myself in this, over the last 20 years, I've just had a reflex. Well, if it involves any sort of government interventions, if it doesn't involve free trade, it must, by definition, be mistaken, and that's the test. But I think that the question has to be: is it in our interest? And I think our trading relationship, as it's developed the last 15 years with China, is not in our interest. And I think some of the ways you'd want to remedy that do not necessarily accord with free trade orthodoxy. So in that case, it's free trade orthodoxy that has to be cast aside. But I don't think, as Jorm and some others might argue, that being a nationalist means necessarily you want to break up the big tech companies, that you want an industrial policy. You can have a debate about whether those are wise or not, but they're not necessarily entailed just by your recognition of how important the nation is and how a constituent part of it has to be a powerful, or at least strong and capable government at the national level.
Well, I think that's fairly clear. I mean, I think there obviously would be difficulties in distinguishing between, on the one hand, protectionism, and on the other hand, a rejection of a rigid free trade orthodoxy. You could see possibly that protectionism might have bad results for the nation, while at the same time wanting to intervene to make sure this particular group of workers not suffer unduly from changes in the terms of trade.
So during this crisis, people focused on how the United States doesn't manufacture generic drugs anymore, and we're dependent on China for basic things like penicillin. So I went back and wrote a column about how this came to be, and it turned out that it used to be a lot of our drugs were manufactured in Puerto Rico because there was a corporate tax break to make them in Puerto Rico. And in 1996, during the Clinton administration, the Republican Congress and Bill Clinton agreed they were going to roll back that tax break because there's no rational reason for it. It's corporate welfare. I'm sure NR, if we treated this at all, we supported repealing this tax break. It's on you, John. But what happened? So we repeal the tax break, and where do these companies go? Do they come back to the continental United States? No, they all go to China, because China is this massive corporate welfare machine that uses every means, fair and foul, to try to get manufacturing based on its shores, and then use that for its own purposes, whether it's stealing intellectual property or whether it's, in the case of this crisis, trying to hoard drugs and medical supplies and protective gear to take care of their people first. Now, I think that's an understandable impulse. I think we saw every country around the world try to do that in this crisis because their first responsibility of government is to take care of its own. But it just shows that if what we took what we thought was a pure free market measure by ending that tax break, but it didn't have pure free market results because there was this huge mercantilist state that took advantage of it.
No. And I think, by the way, if you were arguing that case, you could cite Adam Smith, who says very clearly that opulence is less important than defense. And we have to watch how that plays out, because if we don't watch, we find that every chocolate cream manufacturer in the country is claiming it's necessary for the defense of America. But common sense comes to our help, I think. I want to turn to a slightly different point now, and that is Donald Trump. Now, I think you were attacked in the Washington Post review as someone who had stepped forward to give Trump an ideology he couldn't develop for himself. And I don't obviously think that's fair, but I do think there is some kind of a link between all of these books emerging and the emergence of Trump. And I'm not a trumpet. And I'm curious as to get your view on how that works out. What is the link?
Absolutely, and I don't think it's fair what the Washington Post said about me, but there's clearly been an effort to, in retrospect, come up with a program for Trump, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's actually a good thing. But what we saw in 2016 was Trump, who had kind of a certain instinct or impulse toward a kind of nationalism. Very crudely expressed usually, but what one signal moment was actually in one of the Republican debates. Someone said, one of the moderators said to him, well, the former president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, says, you uses an expletive about Donald Trump and his wall. And Trump's answer was, I think the wall just got 10 feet higher. and I had Republican operatives texting me, he just won the nomination. He just won the nomination. It was something that no one else would have said. Most people said, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Fox feels that way, and we'd reach out to him and work with them. But Trump expressed, this poorly formulated and instinctive nationalism that was appealing to people and appealing to people in part because, as we talked earlier, the Republican establishment and elite had kind of lost touch with that kind of sentiment. But it had, no one's ever accused Donald Trump of overthinking anything, and there wasn't much of a program or workable program attached to any of this. But he highlighted things that have been neglected in our political debate. And I hadn't thought about nationalism much at all. I probably shared some of the lazy assumptions about it, and it was Trump's inaugural address that had nationalistic themes that, when I thought about it, just were common sense and didn't justify the hysterical reaction they generated. And that's what really set me down the path of ultimately writing this book. But that's a good thing. We shouldn't be. The principles are important, but you shouldn't be set in amber forevermore in terms of your policy preferences or in terms of your thinking. New circumstances and ideas and developments should cause you to, react and kick the tires of your own assumptions and see whether you still think they're as sound as they were at the beginning.
Yes, and it's clear that sometimes our hopes are disappointed, and we then have to return to what we originally thought and rethink it. Now, Trump is, of course, unpopular in many of the countries of Europe and the world. But he's not unpopular in the following 4 countries. And I'd like you to explore what links them. Those countries are Poland, Hungary, Israel, and India. In all of these countries, he polls quite well, sometimes very well. Can you see reasons for that?
Well, they're all countries that have governments, for better or worse, I would say, especially worse with regard to India, but that are concerned with their national sovereignty and preserving their national cultures, and I think recognize a friend in Donald Trump. One of probably the best speech, I should say, of Donald Trump's presidency was given in Warsaw, and it was a profound speech. It was a moving speech about the endurance of the Polish nation, despite being occupied, despite being partitioned at various times. And Trump in that speech enunciated a basic point of view that was shared by Rousseau, who wrote about how the Polish people, if they held to their culture, could never be eliminated. And he wrote that at a time when Russia was occupying Poland. And he was absolutely right. And Israel, of course, one of the reasons it is so hated around the world is it is a nationalistic country that is dead set on preserving its sovereignty and its existence and its unique culture. And Trump is very friendly with Benjamin Netanyahu, and has moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, and in various other ways just made it clear that he has Israel's back. So I think those would be the common threads among those countries. I wonder what his numbers are like in Japan.
Yes, I think that is interesting. I must check that one. I have to throw in, of course, the question about Brexit. Is Brexit the same kind of thing we see in Europe, in a sense described as populist nationalism or national populism, or is it something different? Or is it something different to Trump?
Yeah, it's a similar phenomenon. It's in the same class, and it was just Britain deciding, we're going to be governed fully and wholly by Westminster rather than by Brussels. And I don't even know why that was a controversial proposition. I think resting back 100% of the country's sovereignty was worth all the political tumult, would have been even worth the economic catastrophe that was predicted, but didn't come about. So this was a historic pivot point. And nationalism, it doesn't mean that you don't trade with other countries. It doesn't mean that you don't have alliances with other countries. It doesn't mean you don't have friends around the world. But it does, at the most basic level, mean that you should govern yourself. And I think this is just a very basic human impulse. We've had empires throughout world history. We've had some very successful and long-lasting empires. The Habsburg Empire right there in Central Europe exists for 600 years. But constantly the nations that were a constituent part of that empire were straining against their constraints, were pushing to have more autonomy, were pushing to have their unique cultures and their languages honored. And once the history is, once the ability or the will of the central power to impose itself by force gives way, then the constituent nations go on their own and say, thank you very much, we're going to govern ourselves. That was true of the Habsburgs, it was true of the Ottomans, true of the Russian and the Soviet empires, true of the European colonial empires. And this just a basic impulse. And if you run against the grain of it, as the EU does, you're going to get a reaction. And you've gotten it in Britain, and you're getting it elsewhere.
I agree about that. Let me just ask you this question. There are three obvious things that could happen to the European Union. One is it could successfully establish itself as a new kind of empire with its central government and central governing institutions. The other is it could hit a brick wall and break up. And the third is it could transform itself into something a little more like the Austria-Hungary, a little more like Germany before 1870, in which what you have is all kind of central governing institutions which are very light and which make allowance for national differences and cultural differences. Which of those would you bet on at the moment, of those three likelihoods?
Well, I wouldn't bet on the first. I just think the pressures that we've talked about are so strong. We've seen them in the coronavirus crisis, where Germany, which famously in the 2015 migrant crisis, we just says we have to accept everyone. Don't fortify your borders, Hungary, against this influx. Germany was implemented various border restrictions against travel and exporting medical goods without coordinating with the countries around it, because Germany, at the end of the day, is about Germans, which is what it should be, within constraints and with particularly with its liberal democratic culture now. So I think it's going to be too hard to do number one. So I would bet on probably number three. I would hope for a soft version of number two, a breakup, and then you can have a customs union or trading arrangements. But so far it's endured more than I would have expected. The EU in the scheme of world history, 50 years is not a very long time, but the longer it endures, the longer it's likely to stay with us. But hopefully with that kind of light touch that you described in option three.
I'm sure you're right, by the way, that the political will to keep some kind of EU going is very strong, and we've seen it in crisis after crisis. So it's very hard, really, to make an absolute bet. Now, I'd want to turn to a policy for a moment, and that is to say a lot of Europeans, intellectuals and governments, bureaucrats, would argue that America First leadership, a nationalist leadership, is incompatible with American leadership of NATO and the other Euro-Atlantic institutions. Do you think that's so? Or is there some kind of appropriate nationalist leadership in foreign relations that works?
Yeah, well, I think we saw it in the 20th century. The emphasis in the United States was on nationalism, properly understood. So you had both Wilson and FDR were opposed to European colonial empires and thought people should govern themselves, and wanted to create a world of free and sovereign nations that were respected, and one in which borders were sacrosanct in a way they hadn't been before. And this project was largely successful. We live in the world of their creation, where we live in a world of nation states, and we live in a nation of borders. So I don't think Trump, I don't think there's enough substance or heft just to the insight that we should have independent nations and they should follow their own interest. I mean, that's a truism, and Trump has said that in his various UN speeches. It's fine as far as it goes, but you need more than that, and you need more of a theory of where you think where you want things to go and what your national interest is and how to pursue it, and just obviously international institutions that don't impinge on your sovereignty and that are entered into democratically and eyes wide open and have exit ramps, and that serve your interest are a good thing.
Rich, thank you. I want now to play a kind of a modest parlor game. I'm going to ask you to identify as either nationalist or anti-nationalist, crude distinction, a number of leading statesmen over the years from the United States, from Europe, from Britain, and so on. So you don't have to give reasons, you can just say anti-nationalist or nationalist, depending. So first of all, Reagan.
A nationalist of a certain sort, but a nationalist.
Yeah. Okay. FDR.
A nationalist.
This is easy. Teddy Roosevelt.
Nationalist.
Jack Kennedy.
That's interesting. I think there was and Reagan partook of this, so that's why I was of a certain sort. There was a kind of a consensus nationalism in mid 20th century America that didn't have a lot of edge to it. That didn't have kind of this emphasis on culture and on borders that we've talked about, but that was identifiable, and the moonshot was a nationalistic endeavor. It was undertaken in competition with a great national rival, the Soviet Union. It was fused with patriotic symbols. The eagle was landed. The famous phrase was because the landing module was called the Eagle. The symbol for the Apollo program was this fearsomely spread-winged eagle. They had discussed planting a UN flag on the moon. That was quickly abandoned. They planted an American flag. So that's a nationalistic endeavor, but it's kind of as I say, a consensus nationalism. Yeah. That the direct relationship, there's a relationship with kind of a Trumpian nationalism we've been talking about, but it's not exactly the same thing.
Okay. Woodrow Wilson.
That's a tough one. There's nationalism to Wilson, but then there's this overweening idealism. So I'd put him somewhere in between.
Okay. Now I look at the Brits. Disraeli.
Nationalist.
Churchill.
A nationalist, except for both Churchill and de Gaulle. I don't know whether you're going to get to de Gaulle, who are nationalists, have a major blind spot, which they have, an attachment to the empire, which is a profound trampling of other people's nationalism.
Thatcher.
A nationalist of a Reagan type.
Yeah. Blair.
Anti-nationalist.
I think so too. Continental Europe. Bismarck.
Nationalist.
Adenauer.
I really don't know enough. What would you?
I would say that he was, given the conditions of Germany when he became Chancellor, I think he had a very clear idea that Germany could only prosper if it aligned itself clearly with the West. So he was a nationalist, but a nationalist who was prepared to put a lot of things into cold storage while he forged new alliances. I would say the interesting one is, I think Merkel is an anti-nationalist, but Kohl, where would you put him?
A democratic nationalist. Merkel is clearly an anti-nationalist, but it's very rare to find someone that there's not some nationalism in. So with Merkel, it's this kind of subterranean nationalism where under the guise of this supranational project, she is promoting Germany's interest. So it's very rare to find an anti-nationalist who really wants to harm the interests of their own country. And I put Macron in the same category. Has this sweeping rhetoric about what the EU is going to do and its potential, and how he gave the speech where Trump was in the audience about how nationalism turns us back on what's best about us. But he is thoroughly French.
Well, I won't ask you about France then, because you've already answered the two main ones with de Gaulle and Macron there. But I think we might just look at I'm calling it Russia, previously the Soviet Union. Lenin and Stalin?
Anti-nationalist, but with the caveat we were just discussing. But I think their dictators can and do very often appeal to nationalist sentiment. But I think a true nationalism, one of the key insights is that the nation belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to a monarch. It doesn't belong to an empire. It belongs to the people. And Lenin and Stalin, obviously, hideous violation of that basic principle. And Stalin especially, held other nations captive. So it wasn't just that Russia didn't belong to its people. None of these countries in Eastern Europe belong to their peoples either. So he appealed to Russian sentiments, and patriotism in World War II. but otherwise profoundly anti-nationalist.
I'm only going to ask you about one Russian, and precisely because he's a very difficult case, I think, and that's Gorbachev.
Yeah. I think a kind of nationalist. What do you think?
Well, I think that he wanted to save the system, and it was a communist system, which he didn't want to see collapse. On the other hand, he didn't want to see the country he was governing just carry on downwards indefinitely. So there was a patriotic element there. But of course, if you've inherited a corrupt position and even worked with that corrupt position, it's very hard for you to have, so to speak, an uncorrupt patriotic or nationalist ambition. It's there, but it's rendered well, embarrassing, and well, you don't quite know how to do it. And in the end, of course, he did bring a peaceful end to the Soviet Union. I mean, that I think has to be, the credit has to be given there.
That's a big achievement, but I think, given what you just said, we put him in the anti-nationalist category.
Yeah. Now, I have a few questions to finally bring the discussion to an end, regrettably on my part, regretfully rather. And the first is, and it's there about American politics. Now, challenges are supposed to unite nations, but I don't have the sense that COVID-19, though it's a very big challenge, is uniting the US. Am I right or wrong?
It's not uniting the US. I think people tend to have a misunderstanding or a belief that partisan divisions and contention are suspended at times of crisis. Maybe that's true, say, in World War II more than it was at other times, although there was still a lot of contention. But the Civil War, the North was torn apart with political divisions at the same time it was waging the war with the South. The war on terror in the United States, there's the brief period where George W. Bush has a 90% approval rating, and there's a kind of a consensus over invading Afghanistan, but very quickly erodes, and there's a major anti-war movement. And our colleague Rick Brookhiser was pointing out to us just the other day, this kind of thing only Rick would know. In the 1790s, there was the yellow fever outbreak, I think maybe in Philadelphia. And if you go back and read what these great American statesmen, the greatest statesmen in our history and perhaps in world history were saying about one another and blaming one another over it, it's quite hair-raising. So I think what we've done is kind of a characteristic American response. It was too slow. It was bumbling at the beginning. The media and progressives tend to point their fingers just at Trump, but the largest outbreak was in New York City, and the mayor and the governor there were very late and made some disastrous mistakes, reassuring people about how safe it was to ride the subways, putting COVID patients into nursing homes, which we're going to have a struggle dealing with this epidemic in the best of circumstances. But we've avoided the worst in terms of our hospitals getting overwhelmed. There's fear of shortage of ventilators. The Trump administration figured out very clever ways to get around that. Now we'll have an excess of ventilators. The congressional spending bills, there's been a lot of argument about them, but at the end of the day, they passed by huge bipartisan margins. And the opening up now, which is very controversial in the United States, and you have a lot of the media saying any governor who wants to open his or her state back up, has blood on his or her hands, is not just a red state phenomenon. It's happening in blue states as well. Just because we saved the hospitals and bent the curve, the proverbial curve, which was the original justification for the lockdown, and now we're on the other side of the curve, and clearly it's time to start opening up. Now you want to do it carefully. But it's time to do it. So I think there's more broad agreement than people see at first glance, one, and two, just having poisonous charges back and forth at a time like this is not anything new in America, and in fact is really the norm.
It's really the norm of democratic politics everywhere, isn't it? Well, my final question, therefore, is you've looked at all of these questions in our debate, and we ask, therefore, what will be the issues in the next election? I think some of the things you've just dealt with, and more importantly, who is on course to win?
Well, if the election were held today, Biden would win, I believe. Joe Biden, the last people really saw of him, the last time he made an impression, he was sweeping the so-called Super Tuesday primaries and giving it for him quite a good and lively victory speech. And then he retreated into his basement as people began to isolate during this crisis. And he hasn't been heard from again. You know, he does some cable interviews and some live stream events, but the audience is very small. So he's really become kind of a generic Democrat. And I think running against a generic Democrat, Donald Trump would lose right now and probably lose in November. And just the conditions, you know, he had a tailwind, amazing economy chugging along, and it just in mid-March just stopped with a screeching halt. So now I think in the best of circumstances, he's going to have a headwind in the fall. There's some possibility the virus will be peaking again, and then even if we're the economy is opened back up and we're doing pretty well, unemployment is going to be at elevated levels for a very long time. The reason why I don't discount Trump is at the end of the day, Joe Biden will not be a generic Democrat. He will have to reemerge. There'll be an argument about him and his capabilities and his views. And Donald Trump has just proven over the last 4 years during his astronomical rise in our politics that there's one thing it's good at. It's honing in on someone else's weaknesses and pounding it into the ground. And he hasn't really started doing that with Biden, but he will. So I might at this juncture still say Biden is a slight favorite in November. But there's a long way from here to there, and I don't count Trump out at all.
Rich, that's been a marvelous discussion from this side of the table. I'm very grateful for you for making time for it. Thanks again. And of course, we should end the discussion as an awful lot of people remark, a lot of people all around the world say, which is God bless America. All the best.
Thanks so much, John. God bless you.